Imagine the moment. September 6, 1566. Inside an opulent silk pavilion somewhere in Hungary, a court doctor draws a blade across the abdomen of the most powerful ruler alive. This is no attempt at healing. The man on the table is already dead. Suleiman the Magnificent has breathed his last. To prevent the stench of decay from spreading through the encampment, his physicians work in desperate silence, removing his internal organs and hiding them beneath the earth, beneath the tent. Outside those fabric walls, an army of nearly 100,000 roars with celebration, convinced their emperor still lives and leads them. They march and fight for a ruler who no longer exists. This carefully maintained illusion defines the siege of Szigetvár, a campaign driven by secrecy, deliberate sacrifice, and an almost irrational refusal to surrender. Yet the deception is not one-sided. Several miles away, inside a fortress engulfed in fire and smoke, the enemy commander prepares for his own end. Nikola Šubić Zrinski does not conceal death. He welcomes it. He dons an elegant silk garment. He sets a weighty, jewel-studded helmet upon his head. Then, in a final symbolic act, he stitches 100 gold ducats into his coat. He tells his soldiers that whoever strikes him down has earned payment. He will not die as a pauper. Two aging leaders, one hidden beneath perfume and falsehoods, the other clothed in wealth, marching willingly toward fate. Before we can understand how this grim pact concludes, we must first understand why it began. Before we explore these nearly forgotten accounts of endurance and devastation, if uncovering the unseen side of history interests you, consider supporting the channel and subscribing. And feel free to leave a comment about where you're listening from. It's remarkable to think that stories centuries old still connect people across the globe through shared curiosity. Vienna was the ultimate objective. For nearly half a century, Suleiman had pushed Ottoman power across 3 continents, yet Europe's crown jewel remained untouched. Now 72 years old, crippled by gout and unable to ride, he was carried across Hungary in a litter by servants. This was not the campaign of a young conqueror. It was the final ambition of an aging emperor determined to end his life victorious. To prevent the route to Vienna, the small fortress of Szigetvár stood in the way. Suleiman expected it to collapse within days. By all logic, it should have. The Ottoman host numbered close to 100,000 fighters, supported by hundreds of cannons and a massive supply chain stretching for miles. Opposing them was a force barely worth noting, just 2,300 defenders under Zrinski's command, mostly Croatian and Hungarian foot soldiers with limited cavalry support. No reinforcements would come. Although Emperor Maximilian II sat nearby with a powerful army, he chose not to intervene. Szigetvár was sacrificed to buy time. Zrinski understood this clearly. He had been left behind. When the Ottoman advance arrived on August 5th, the earth itself seemed to tremble. Their camp spread across the land like snow after a storm. Drums thundered, prayers echoed, and the clamor of thousands of weapons filled the air. Often, the sheer presence of such a force was enough to break resistance without a single shot. Suleiman sent word to the fortress with a familiar offer. Zrinski could surrender and rule Croatia under Ottoman authority, or he could die. Most men would have accepted. Zrinski answered with cannon fire. By ordering his guns to roar, he did more than refuse surrender. He openly mocked the Sultan's mercy. Surrounded, outnumbered, and abandoned, he chose defiance over survival. That single act transformed a minor military problem into something far more dangerous, a personal vendetta. Suleiman, burning with anger and racked by pain, ordered an attack at once. He wanted the fortress erased. In his mind, the Janissaries would pour over the walls and eliminate the irritation before the day was done. He miscalculated. What the aging Sultan failed to grasp was that he had stepped into a killing ground, one that would drain his army, stain his reputation, and ultimately claim his life. The siege was now underway, and the first assault would soon prove a brutal lesson. Sheer numbers lose their power when forced through narrow gates and confined ground. To understand why this clash became so savage, we must look past the legend of the Magnificent and confront the man behind it. By 1566, Suleiman was no longer the unstoppable force that had once terrified Europe. At 72, he was an old man by the standards of the 16th century. He had ruled for 46 years, longer than any Ottoman sultan before him. Under his banner, the empire had stretched from the deserts of Mesopotamia to the plains of Hungary. He had shattered the Hungarian kingdom at Mohacs decades earlier, and once stood before the gates of Vienna in 1529. That failure haunted him. Storms, stubborn fortifications, and time itself had forced him to withdraw. It remained the lone blemish on an otherwise unrivaled record of conquest. He could not accept dying without seizing Europe's golden apple. Now, however, time had become his most relentless enemy. Gout had swollen his legs so badly that standing caused unbearable pain. The image of a warrior emperor leading his troops on horseback had vanished. Instead, he traveled concealed in a hanging litter, shielded by curtains so his soldiers would not witness his frailty. Rouge colored his cheeks to suggest health where little remained. His body was failing, but his will was not. This campaign was his final declaration to the world and to himself that he was still the ruler of rulers. His aim was nothing less than the humiliation of the Habsburgs, the capture of Vienna, and the power to dictate terms to the Holy Roman Emperor. Szigetvár was never meant to matter. It was simply an obstacle standing between him and immortality. Opposing him was a man forged from similar steel, though commanding far fewer resources. Nikola Šubić Zrinski was 58, a Croatian nobleman serving as Ban of Croatia and a general in Habsburg service. He wore no crown, yet along the contested frontier his authority was unquestioned. Zrinski had spent his entire adult life fighting the Ottomans. He understood their methods, their discipline, and their cruelty. He spoke their language and had survived their wars. His reputation was built on ingenuity and defiance. He specialized in uneven warfare, striking supply lines, ambushing columns, then vanishing into forests and marshes. Wealthy, influential, and unyielding, he had long refused to bend. Years earlier, he had personally angered Suleiman. The Sultan claimed authority over Zrinski's ancestral lands and demanded tribute. Zrinski replied not with coin, but with force, defeating the local Ottoman governor and making it clear that not a single ducat would be sent to Istanbul. To Suleiman, this was more than resistance. It was open defiance. The Sultan did not forget such insults. When the Ottoman host turned towards Szigetvár, the decision was strategic, but it was also deeply personal. Suleiman intended to crush the Croatian lord and send a warning to every minor ruler in Europe. Defy the empire, and you will be erased. The scale of the army assembled was meant to overwhelm the mind before battle even began. Contemporary observers described the Ottoman camp as a city on the move. Miles of white and green tents stretched across the landscape in rigid, ordered rows. 300 cannons accompanied the army, including enormous siege guns built to pulverize stone fortifications. Endless columns of camels, wagons, and pack animals carried food, ammunition, and luxuries for the officers. Nearly 100,000 soldiers marched beneath the banners, their footsteps causing the ground itself to shudder. This was a force capable of toppling kingdoms, and yet it had halted to deal with a single fortress. Inside Szigetvár, the reality was bleak. Zrinski commanded roughly 2,300 men, Croatian heavy infantry, Hungarian light cavalry, and local militia. They were seasoned fighters, veterans of years of frontier warfare, well supplied with weapons and resolve. But no amount of courage could alter the arithmetic. They faced odds approaching 50 to 1. Zrinski had prepared the fortress with stockpiled food and powder, knowing a prolonged siege was likely. Still, he understood the truth of his situation. He had written repeatedly to Emperor Maximilian II, whose army of 80,000 waited near Győr, strong enough to challenge Suleiman directly. No answer came. The Habsburg strategy was brutally pragmatic. Szigetvár would be allowed to die slowly, draining Ottoman strength and delaying their advance until winter closed the roads to Vienna. Zrinski was being spent to buy time. He understood this. So did his men. No relief force would appear on the horizon. When the first Ottoman scouts crested the distant rises overlooking the wetlands, Zrinski summoned his senior officers. He did not disguise the truth with stirring speeches or hollow promises. Instead, he proposed an oath. He pledged that he would never desert them, that he would endure the same hunger, sleep on the same unforgiving ground, and share every hardship they faced. He swore that as long as he lived, surrender would never be spoken. In exchange, he demanded absolute loyalty and their lives. They accepted. The gates were sealed, the drawbridges lifted. What followed was the meeting of two absolutes, overwhelming power colliding with unbreakable resolve. On one side stood an empire at the height of its reach, commanded by an aging ruler desperate to carve one last triumph into history. On the other stood a garrison already condemned, led by a man who valued honor above survival. The surrounding lowlands, flat, waterlogged, and treacherous, were about to become the most costly ground on the continent. Suleiman ordered his pavilion raised on a nearby rise called Similehov, granting him a clear view of the coming assault. He anticipated a swift conclusion. His instructions were blunt: seize the fortress, deliver Zrinski's head, and reopen the road to Vienna. The artillery began firing at dawn. Terrain decides battles long before soldiers do. At Szigetvár, geography favored the defenders and tormented the attackers. Forget the image of a stone castle crowning a hill. This fortress was born of mud and water. It sat low along the Alma stream, spread across 3 separate islands rising from marshland. It was not a single stronghold, but a layered system of defenses, each one demanding blood to breach. First came the new town, the largest island, shielded by earthen ramparts and thick wooden walls packed with mud. If that fell, attackers still faced a narrow, exposed bridge leading to the old town. Beyond that lay yet another crossing to the inner citadel, a stone core where Zrinski commanded the defense. Encircling everything was a moat fed by the river, stagnant, thick with mud, and hostile to movement. Cavalry was useless. Infantry advances became slow, deadly crawls. The defenders could retreat from island to island, forcing the besiegers to fight the same battle again and again. For the Ottoman engineers, water was the true enemy. Tunnels collapsed as soon as they were dug. Siege towers bogged down and sank. Nothing heavy moved easily through the mire. Brute force would not suffice. The Ottomans turned to engineering. Thousands of laborers guarded by archers carved drainage channels to divert the stream and lower the water level. Zigzagging approach trenches crept forward inch by inch, allowing troops to advance under cover. From the walls, Zrinski watched the land itself being reshaped. He knew the marsh would not protect him forever. Until then, he exploited every advantage. His sharpshooters, armed with finely made German muskets, transformed the wetlands into a killing ground. Every helmet that rose above a trench risked a fatal shot. The defenders did not remain passive. Zrinski ordered sudden sorties, violent bursts of action in which cavalry thundered out of the gates, cut down laborers working the moat, and vanished before Janissary formations could respond. This was siege warfare as it truly existed in the 16th century, less about heroic duels, more about mud, exhaustion, and attrition. The Ottomans raised earthen platforms reinforced with timber, bringing their artillery level with the walls. Cannon fire never ceased. Iron shot slammed into the wooden defenses day and night, splintering beams, churning earth, and denying the defenders rest. The bombardment itself became a weapon of the mind. By August 19th, the summer heat had hardened the mud. The drainage efforts succeeded. The moat around the new town grew shallow enough to cross. The Ottoman ring tightened. Assault troops advanced behind massive wooden shields and rolling screens. From the hilltop, Suleiman grew restless. The old ruler no longer wished to wait. He demanded an attack. The slow work of digging was finished. He wanted to see his standards flying from the walls. At dawn on August 19th, the marshlands echoed with the sound that had haunted Europe for generations, the thunder of Ottoman war drums and the piercing cry of the Zurna horns. The era of earthworks ended. The slaughter began. Suleiman had grown weary of patience. He unleashed his lions. At the front of the assault came the Janissaries. These were not hastily armed farmers pushed into battle. They were the Sultan's elite, Europe's first permanent professional army since the fall of Rome. Taken from Christian families as boys, reshaped through forced conversion, and trained relentlessly from childhood, they existed for one purpose alone: war. Their loyalty belonged only to the Sultan. Clad in tall white felt caps, they advanced with a discipline that felt inhuman. There were no panicked cries, no hesitation. They moved as one body, stepping over fallen comrades without breaking formation, driving forward toward the walls. The attack on the new town marked the violent meeting of two ages. Medieval wooden defenses groaned beneath the force of gunpowder warfare. Ottoman cannon fire had already torn openings in the palisades, and through these gaps the Janissaries surged like floodwater. Zrinski's men answered with gunfire at arm's length. Musket volleys ripped through the white ranks, dropping attackers by the dozens. Yet the tide did not slow. For every man who fell, others climbed over his body. Numbers began to overwhelm skill. Along the parapets, defenders hacked at hands and helmets appearing over the edge. Steel dulled against bone and iron. Inside the new town, the fight disintegrated into savage close-quarter clashes from street to street. The outer defenses could not hold. Zrinski fought among his men, blade drawn, and saw the moment clearly. Remaining meant destruction. He ordered the withdrawal. This was the most perilous phase of the battle. To retreat, the defenders had to disengage from hand-to-hand combat, turn their backs, and sprint across the narrow bridge linking the new town to the old. Fear surged. The crossing clogged instantly. Men shoved past one another in desperation. Some fell and were trampled. Ottoman archers seized the opportunity, loosing arrows into the packed bridge, slicking the planks with blood. Zrinski stood at the gate of the old town, hauling men inside by force, shouting commands to keep order. As the last rear guard stumbled across, the Ottoman vanguard closed in, blades raised. But the attackers had overlooked one final preparation. Zrinski had ordered his engineers to lace the abandoned houses of the new town with powder and pitch. The moment the heavy gates slammed shut, a torch was hurled back across the bridge. The result was immediate and catastrophic. Fire raced through the dry wooden structures, turning the new town into a roaring furnace. Flames rose in walls so intense that the pursuing Janissaries staggered back, shielding their faces. The inferno denied the attackers both shelter and plunder. And, more importantly, it bought the defenders precious time. From the old town's walls, the survivors watched their former homes burn. They were fewer now, wounded, exhausted, crushed into a smaller perimeter. The outer island was lost. Through smoke and heat distortion, they could see Ottoman crews hauling cannons forward, setting them up on ground the defenders had occupied only hours earlier. The distance had collapsed. The hunt had closed to arm's length. With artillery now positioned just beyond the walls, the nature of the siege changed completely. The bombardment was no longer distant thunder. It became a constant pounding quake. Each impact shook the saturated ground so violently that men were thrown from the ramparts without ever being struck. The old town's masonry began to fail. Its walls were never meant to endure direct fire from heavy iron shot at close range. Inside, a new enemy took hold: decay. Summer heat trapped in the marshlands turned the air thick and foul. Bodies from earlier assaults lay unburied between the lines, swelling in the sun and poisoning the wind. Water supplies dwindled, wells grew brackish or ran dry. Men fought with cracked lips and swollen tongues. This was attritional warfare at its purest. Suleiman no longer needed to rush the walls. Thirst, disease, and exhaustion could finish the job. Morale began to fracture. One officer, driven to desperation by sleepless nights and relentless shelling, suggested opening talks with the Ottomans to negotiate safe passage. Zrinski answered without debate. The man was seized and executed in the town square. Zrinski lifted the severed head before the garrison, not as a threat, but as a declaration. There would be no surrender, no negotiations, no escape. The message was clear. Szigetvár would end only in smoke or death. The effect was immediate. Complaints vanished. The men returned to their posts, terrified of the enemy beyond the walls, but more afraid of the commander behind them. By early September, the old town was shattered. Breaches gaped in multiple sections of the wall. The Janissaries prepared another mass assault. Sensing collapse, Zrinski took stock. Fewer than 1,000 men remained capable of fighting. The perimeter was too large to defend. On the night of September 5th, under cover of darkness, he ordered another withdrawal. The defenders crossed the final bridge into the citadel, the inner keep, the last refuge. 800 survivors packed into the stone fortress, shoulder to shoulder with the wounded, women and children. The drawbridge rose. They turned back and looked at what remained. The Ottomans surged into the abandoned old town, shouting in celebration. To them, the fight appeared finished. Victory seemed certain. What they did not understand was that they had just driven a wounded predator into a corner, one from which it would strike with everything it had left. History has a taste for cruel symmetry, and on the night of September 6th, it delivered one of its darkest jokes. As Zrinski prepared himself for a final, desperate struggle against Suleiman the Magnificent, his enemy was already dead. Inside the imperial pavilion on Simlehof Hill, the 72-year-old ruler simply stopped breathing. The heart that had dominated Europe for nearly 50 years failed quietly. There was no heroic end, no last proclamation. Only stillness beneath silk and velvet. For most armies, this moment would have ended the campaign instantly. In Ottoman custom, the death of a sultan often triggered chaos. Soldiers abandoning the front to loot, officers racing toward Istanbul to support rival heirs. If word spread, the siege would disintegrate within hours. Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha understood this at once. Standing over his ruler's lifeless body, he made a decision that required absolute ruthlessness. As far as the empire was concerned, the Sultan was not dead, not yet. He ordered the physicians to carry out a secret procedure, removing the heart and internal organs and burying them beneath the tent itself. The body was washed, wrapped in perfumed shrouds to slow decay, and dressed in full ceremonial robes. Then Sokolu crossed a final line. The doctors were sworn to silence under threat of death. Some accounts claim he ensured their silence permanently. For the next 2 days, the Grand Vizier ruled through a corpse. He sat beside the body as if receiving commands, forged the Sultan's signature on decrees, and issued orders in his name. Meals were sent from the royal kitchens as though the ruler had just eaten. Musical bands played the marches Suleiman loved most. Outside the tent, messengers bowed before a shadow they believed was alive. An army of 100,000 now obeyed a dead man, guided entirely by a single official who carried the fate of the empire through deception alone. Inside the citadel, Zrinski knew none of this. He saw the imperial banners still flying. He heard the war drums beating for the final assault. In his mind, he was still defying the living embodiment of imperial power. The tragedy is almost unbearable. He was preparing to give everything to stop a man who no longer existed. The two commanders were now divided not by walls, armies, or belief, but by life itself. One was alive, fighting for a doomed cause. The other was dead, commanding a very real army. The final absurdity approached. Speaking with the authority of a dead ruler, Sokolu sent one last demand into the citadel. It offered surrender and mercy, granted in the name of someone incapable of granting either. Zrinski answered with gunpowder. He would not submit to a tyrant, living or otherwise. Dawn broke on September 7th over a scene of utter ruin. The citadel was no longer a fortress. It was a shattered cage of stone, cloaked in smoke and ash. Ottoman cannon fire had reduced the walls to rubble. The moat was filled with debris and corpses. The air burned with sulfur and the certainty of death. Before ordering the final assault, Sokolu made one last attempt to spare his army further losses. He launched a message into the citadel, wrapped in oilcloth and carried by arrow. The offer was generous, almost irresistible. Zrinski would be made hereditary ruler of Croatia. His men would receive gold and safe passage. Their lives would be spared. All they had to do was lower the flag. Zrinski did not respond in writing. He understood that in this world, honor carried more weight than survival. To accept now, after watching comrades die and his city burn, would strip meaning from their sacrifice. He had the arrow broken and thrown into the fire. Then he pointed toward the Ottoman command tent. The reply came in the form of cannon fire ripping through the morning mist. The message was unmistakable: come and take it. Yet the most terrible struggle was unfolding far from the walls, deep within the cellars of the keep, an episode history often softens or omits. But to understand 1566, it must be faced. In the darkness below, the wives and daughters of the officers huddled together. They knew what followed the fall of a Christian fortress. The men would be slaughtered. The women would be taken, sold, enslaved, or sent east as spoils of war. According to the few surviving accounts, a grim reckoning took place. No one asked for comforting lies. The women asked for mercy of a different kind, one that sounds brutal to modern ears. They begged not to be taken alive. Some stories say Zrinski's own wife and daughter armed themselves, prepared to die fighting. Others speak of a darker agreement, that death at the hands of loved ones was preferable to capture. The precise truth may never be known, but the outcome was undeniable. Smoke began to rise from the windows of the keep. Zrinski and his remaining fighters began feeding the flames with their lives' possessions. Fine garments, inherited treasures, documents, letters, everything was destroyed. This was deliberate annihilation. If the Ottomans claimed Szigetvár, they would gain nothing but smoke and bones. No treasure, no captives, no spoils to parade as victory. By late morning, the fires had grown uncontrollable. Heat rolled through the citadel, thick and suffocating. Outside, the Ottoman drums thundered without pause, building toward the final signal. Zrinski surveyed what remained of his force. 600 men. They were scorched with soot, wounded, hollow-eyed with hunger. Yet they had delayed an empire for 33 days. There were no defenses left to man. The siege phase was finished. Now came the ending. Inside a smoke-filled chamber of the collapsing tower, Nikola Šubić Zrinski removed his shattered armor. This was not retreat. This was preparation. He dressed deliberately, a clean silk tunic, a heavy velvet coat. Upon his head, a cap decorated with crane feathers and set with a diamond clasp. Then he performed the strangest act of the entire siege. Zrinski took a pouch holding 100 gold ducats and stitched it into the lining of his clothes. Turning to his attendant, he remarked that whoever stripped his body should not feel cheated for the effort. Even now, pride ruled him. He would not leave this world as a pauper. He took up his father's saber, a thick battle-worn blade that had tasted decades of frontier war, and stepped into the courtyard. The survivors waited. They stood battered and bloodied, faces blackened by smoke and powder, bandages soaked through. Zrinski gave no long speech. He pointed toward the gate. There would be no surrender. They would not wait to suffocate in ruins. They would charge. At the citadel's main gate, Ottoman troops packed the drawbridge, shoulder to shoulder. Janissaries waved their curved blades, expecting white flags and broken men. Instead, the massive oak doors began to open. The Ottomans suddenly found themselves staring into the mouth of a cannon. Zrinski had positioned his final heavy gun directly inside the gate, loaded not with a single shot, but with jagged iron scraps, chains, nails, broken metal, anything that could tear flesh apart. The fuse was lit. The blast was devastating. The cannon became a monstrous scattergun, unleashing a storm of metal across the bridge. The front ranks of Janissaries were obliterated. Bodies were ripped apart. The drawbridge ran red as the explosion carved a corridor through the packed formation. Out of the smoke, Zrinski charged, shouting his war cry, "Jesus! Jesus!" The 600 followed. For a brief, almost impossible span of time, the sheer violence of the assault drove the Ottoman vanguard backward. The defenders fought with the wild strength of men already resigned to death. Survival no longer mattered, only damage. This was a true last stand. But numbers and gravity cannot be denied forever. Fresh Ottoman troops poured in. Marksmen lining the moat banks leveled their weapons at the figure wearing the diamond-adorned cap. Shots rang out. Zrinski was struck twice in the chest. An arrow pierced his head. He staggered, fell to one knee, still clutching his sword, then collapsed onto the blood-slicked planks of the bridge. When their commander fell, the remaining defenders were overwhelmed. The Janissaries, furious at the resistance they had endured, showed no restraint. They slaughtered the survivors where they stood. Zrinski's body was seized. His head was severed and raised on a pike, the proof demanded by the empire. The fighting was over. Ottoman troops flooded into the citadel, shouting victory, trampling corpses as they rushed to plunder what remained of the burning stronghold. But Szigetvár offered them nothing. Only fire, only death, only ash.
They believed the reward was finally theirs. What they did not realize was that they were standing atop the most devastating explosive trap of the 16th century. In that era, victory was usually loud, chaotic, and indulgent. Once the final defender fell, the citadel of Szigetvár ceased to be a battlefield and became a frenzy of pillage. Janissaries, still shaking with adrenaline from the slaughter and relief of survival, flooded into the smoldering ruins. They expected payment for their suffering: gold, silver, weapons, proof that a month of blood and exhaustion had been worth it. Thousands of Ottoman troops poured into the inner courtyard. They smashed open doors to storerooms in the powder magazine, convinced they would find treasure chests overflowing with coins. Instead, they found barrels. Accounts from both legend and Ottoman chroniclers describe a final spark, perhaps struck by a young woman hiding among the supplies, perhaps ignited by a slow-burning fuse set by Zrinski before his final charge. The precise cause no longer matters, only the outcome does. At the height of the looting, with nearly 3,000 elite troops packed tightly inside the shattered keep, fire met powder. The explosion was not merely violent, it was seismic. For an instant, the fortress seemed to draw inward, as if inhaling. Then it erupted outward in all directions. Walls that had endured weeks of cannon fire disintegrated into flying stone and iron. A towering column of smoke and debris clawed into the sky. In a single moment, triumph became catastrophe. Thousands of soldiers, the best of the Ottoman army, the men who had led every assault, were burned alive or crushed beneath collapsing masonry. The shockwave hurled men to the ground hundreds of yards away in the main camp. This was Zrinski's final defiance, a trap of unimaginable scale. He had transformed his own fortress into a massive explosive charge. Those who survived stood stunned, coated in dust and ash, struggling to understand what had just happened. Yes, they had taken Szigetvár, but Szigetvár had taken them in return. The strategic consequences were enormous. This was the very definition of a hollow victory. Of the roughly 100,000 troops who had marched west, nearly 30,000 were dead, wounded, or incapacitated. The army had lost its finest officers, its engineers, and, most critically, its confidence. All of that for a smoking ruin sinking into a swamp. Grand Vizier Sokoliu Mehmed Pasha watched the rising cloud from near the tent of his deceased ruler. Even a man known for iron discipline could not ignore the scale of the disaster. He now commanded an army shattered in spirit, led in secret by a dead sultan, having just annihilated thousands of its own elite. The campaign was finished. Vienna was beyond reach. With autumn closing in, this battered force could not advance deeper into Christian lands. The rains would turn roads into quagmires. Moving siege guns and supplies would become impossible. The golden apple of Europe would remain untouched. Grand Vizier Sokoliu Mehmed Pasha ordered a withdrawal, carefully staged to resemble triumph. The army would march back towards Belgrade, still pretending the Sultan lived, still claiming victory. But as the column slogged through the mud, leaving the ruins of Szigetvár behind, the truth settled in. They had been stopped, not by a great king, not by a massive army, but by a stubborn commander and a few thousand defenders who refused to surrender to arithmetic. The Ottoman drive into Central Europe had slammed into a wall built of resolve and corpses, and it would never regain its momentum. Nikola Šubić Zrinski's body was buried beneath the ruins of the fortress he died defending. His head, taken as a trophy, was sent to the Habsburg camp. Eventually, it was laid to rest in a monastery near his homeland, not as a symbol of defeat, but as a relic of sacrifice. Yet the true legacy of Szigetvár is not found in bones or monuments. It is found in time. The siege lasted 33 days. Those 33 days pushed the campaign deep into September. By the time victory was claimed, autumn rains had arrived. Roads dissolved into mud. Logistics collapsed. Because 2,300 men refused to quit, the greatest military power of its age was forced to turn around. Decades later, Cardinal Richelieu would look back on this moment and summarize it with a single phrase: the battle that saved civilization. It's a dramatic assertion, but the sequence of events backs it up. Had Szigetvár collapsed in the few days Suleiman anticipated, the Ottoman army would have been at Vienna's gates before winter closed the roads. Europe's story might have unfolded very differently. The Grand Vizier's deception endured to the final step of the campaign. The army marched all the way back to Belgrade before Sokolli finally revealed that Suleiman the Magnificent had been dead for weeks. The announcement stunned the troops, but it came too late to spark disaster. The soldiers were worn down, scattered, and far from the capital. Any chance of rebellion had already passed. Power transferred to a new ruler, Selim II, without civil war. Yet something far more important had ended. The age of relentless Ottoman expansion expired in the marshes of Szigetvár, alongside the body of its greatest sultan. Vienna would not face another Ottoman siege for more than a century, until 1683. So, what are we meant to take from this blood-soaked last stand in a swamp? It's tempting to dismiss Zrinski as reckless, a commander who sacrificed thousands for pride. But consider the alternative. Emperor Maximilian II sat only days away with 80,000 soldiers, immobilized by caution and political calculation. He preserved his army, he preserved his throne, and history barely remembers him. Zrinski died, but he became something else entirely, a symbol. Croatia's Leonidas. This story forces an uncomfortable question. What is the worth of a fight you know you cannot win? Because victory is not always measured by surviving the battlefield. Sometimes it means delaying disaster just long enough for others to prepare. Sometimes it means forcing history to pause. Zrinski and his improvised army, soldiers and civilians bound by duty and stripped of fear, proved that determination can disrupt even the grand designs of empires. They lost the battle, but they shaped the future. If you found this deep dive into history's most brutal last stand compelling, consider giving the video a like. It helps bring these overlooked stories to a wider audience. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Was Maximilian right to hold back and protect his capital, or should he have marched to save Zrinski?